William Carter raised his rifle to put down the last of his starving cattle. Then the smell of stew stopped his hand cold. He lowered the gun, walked into his own kitchen, and dropped the bowl on the table hard enough to rattle the tin cups. "Who made this?" he demanded. The whole room went dead silent. Every hired hand stared at his plate except one. A heavy-set woman with a wooden spoon stepped forward. "I did, sir." And a man who'd forgotten how to hope felt something crack open inside his chest. If a story about being overlooked and then finally being seen means something to you, please subscribe. Stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. William Carter had not planned to eat that night. He had planned to walk out past the North Penn's lever a shell into his father's old rifle and end the suffering of the 3 cattle too weak to stand. That was all he meant to do. A man did what needed doing on a dying ranch, and mercy was the last thing left he could afford to give. But when he came back through the yard, boots heavy with mud, the rifle still warm in his hand, a smell reached him from the house that he had not smelled in 2 years. It stopped him at the door. For a long moment he stood there, one hand on the frame, and he did not trust it. Smells like that belonged to another time. To his mother, gone 11 years. To winters when the pantry was full and men laughed at his father's table and nobody counted the days until the bank came. He pushed the door open. His hired men were bent over their bowls, eating like men who had forgotten what warm food tasted like. Nobody looked up. Nobody spoke. And on the table sat a pot. His mother's old iron pot, steam curling off the top of it into the lamplight. William set the rifle against the wall. He picked up a spare bowl, ladled some for himself without a word, and lifted a spoonful to his mouth. He stopped chewing. He set the bowl down slowly. "Who made this?" His voice came out lower than he meant it to. Rougher. The men froze. Bill Hutchins, his foreman of 9 years, kept his eyes down. Young Tom went still with his spoon halfway to his lips. Not one of them answered. "I asked a question." William stood up. His chair scraped back. "Who cooked this stew?" Silence. Then from the far corner near the stove, a wooden spoon tapped once against the rim of the pot, and a voice said, "I did, sir." Every head turned. She was standing where the shadows were thickest, as though she had learned long ago that corners were the safest place for a woman like her to be. A big woman. Broad through the shoulders, heavy through the hips, her plain gray dress dusted with flour, and her sleeves pushed to the elbow. Brown hair pulled back in a braid that had come loose over the long day. She held that spoon in both hands like a shield, but she didn't drop her eyes. That was the thing William noticed first. She looked right back at him. "You did," he said. "Yes, sir." "With what? There ain't nothing in that pantry. I counted it myself Tuesday." "There was more than you thought, sir." Her voice was steady, careful, but it didn't shake. "Half a sack of barley gone soft, some carrots and turnips folks called spoiled that weren't spoiled all the way through. A shank bone your men were going to throw to the dogs. Some wild onion off the creek bank." William looked at the bowl, then back at her. "Off the creek bank," he repeated. "Yes, sir." Bill Hutchins finally spoke up low. "Boss, she come in this afternoon, asking after work. I told her we ain't hiring. Told her we can't hardly feed the men we got." "And she cooked anyhow," William said. "Kitchen was empty," the woman said. "I didn't figure it'd do harm to make use of what was already going bad." One of the younger hands, a wiry kid named Dell, with a mean streak that showed when he was tired, snorted into his bowl. "She's been going on all evening about what all she can do. Cook can food men fence." He grinned around the table. "Big talk from a gal who looks like she ain't skipped many suppers herself." A couple of the men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The woman's jaw tightened. She did not laugh, and she did not flinch, and she did not look at Dell at all. She kept her eyes on William. And William, who was tired down to the marrow of his bones, who had a rifle by the door and a bank letter in his coat pocket, and no earthly reason left to be gentle with anyone, set his spoon down and turned to the boy. "Dell." "Yeah, boss. You've eaten 3 bowls. I've been counting." William's voice was flat. "You want to say something to the woman who filled 'em, or you want to keep your mouth on your own business?" The table went quiet. Dell's grin faded. "Didn't mean nothing," he muttered. "Then don't say nothing." William turned back to her. "What's your name?" "Margaret, sir. Margaret Ellis." "You got people Margaret Ellis." "No, sir, not anymore." "Where'd you come in from?" "East. Ohio first, then Kansas. Then a wagon that let me off at your gate this morning." She wet her lips. "I've been walking a while, sir, looking for a place that'd have me." "And how many turned you away?" She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. William had spent his whole life reading livestock and weather and the faces of men who owed him money, and he could read the answer in the set of her shoulders plain as print. Every one of them. Every last place had turned her away, and most of them for the same reason Dell had laughed. William looked down at his bowl again. He picked up the spoon. He ate another mouthful, and then another. And he thought about the 3 cattle lying still out past the north pens, and about the way the whole downstairs of his house had smelled like his mother's kitchen for the first time since they'd buried her. "Bill," he said. "Boss." "How much we got in the account?" Hutchins looked uncomfortable. "You know how much we got." "Say it." "Enough to make one more payment. Maybe. If nothing else dies." The foreman glanced at Margaret, then away. "Not enough to be taking on hands, boss. I'm sorry. She seems a decent sort, but we can't—" "I didn't ask what we can't do." William set the spoon down a final time. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. When he looked up at Margaret Ellis, standing there in the corner, with a wooden spoon gripped in both fists, he felt the strangest thing move through him. Something he had not let himself feel in a long, long time. It wasn't hope. He was too far gone for hope. But it was near enough to hope that it frightened him. "You cooked for 11 men off scraps I'd written off as garbage," he said. "You did it in an afternoon in a kitchen you'd never set foot in a house where nobody wanted you." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, simple as anything, "Because a hungry man can't fix nothing, sir. And it looked to me like everything around here needed fixing." Somebody at the table drew a slow breath. Old Pete, the one who never talked, set down his spoon and looked at her with something like respect. William stood there. The lamp guttered. Out in the dark, a cow lowed once weak and went silent. "You got a place to sleep tonight?" he asked. "No, sir. There's a room off of the kitchen. Was the cook's back when we had a cook." He picked up his rifle from beside the door. "It's yours tonight. We'll talk in the morning about whether it's yours longer." He saw it hit her, saw the spoon go still in her hands, but she didn't gush, and she didn't cry, and she didn't thank him a dozen times over the way some folks would. She just gave one small nod like a woman who had learned not to trust good news till it had a day or two of daylight on it. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said. "I won't be trouble." "Everybody's trouble," William said, and went out into the night. He didn't sleep much. He lay in his bed listening to the old house settle and creak around him, and he thought about the letter in his coat and the 52 days he had left before the Cattlemen's Bank of Helena took everything his father had bled for. He thought about his men, good men, drifting away one by one because he couldn't pay them and couldn't feed them and couldn't promise them a single thing but hard work and heartbreak. And he thought about a big woman standing in the corner of his kitchen, looking him in the eye, while a boy, half her worth, laughed at her and saying a hungry man can't fix nothing. In the morning, he found her already up. The stove was lit. Coffee was on real coffee, though he could not for the life of him figure where she'd found it until she told him she'd dug the last of it out of a tin at the back of a shelf so high none of the men could be bothered to reach it. There was cornbread, too, made from meal he'd thought was too weevil-shot to use. She'd picked it over by lamplight, she said, when she couldn't sleep. "You didn't sleep neither," he said. "New places," she said, and left it at that. William sat down. He ate. The men filed in one by one and ate, and this morning a few of them muttered a low, "Morning, ma'am," as they passed her, and Margaret answered each of them by name, Bill, Tom, Pete, Dell, though she'd only met them the day before. That got William's attention. A person who learned 11 names in an afternoon was a person who paid attention. And a rancher 52 days from ruin had precious little left to trade on but the attention of the people around him. When the men had gone out to the pens, he stayed at the table. So did she, standing by the stove with a dish rag in her hands. "Sit down, Margaret." "I've got dishes, sir." "Dishes'll keep. Sit." She sat. The chair complained under her, and Dell would have laughed, but Dell was out in the yard, and William did not so much as blink. He folded his hands on the table. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said, "on account of I ain't got time to be anything else. This ranch is dying. You probably figured that. The whole county's figured it. I got 52 days to make a payment I can't make, and when I can't make it, the bank takes the land and every hand out in that yard goes looking for work, and you go back to walking. That's the truth of where you've landed." Margaret listened. She didn't look away, and she didn't look scared. She just nodded slow, like she was fitting the news into a place she'd already made ready for it. "So I can't hire you," William went on. "Not proper. I can't pay you a wage 'cause I ain't got a wage to pay. All I can offer is a roof and food off the same scraps you'll be cooking with, and my word that you'll be treated decent under my roof, or the man who treats you otherwise answers to me. That's it. That's the whole of it, and I'd understand if you got up right now and walked back out my gate to find something better." For a long moment, Margaret Ellis said nothing. Then she said, "Mr. Carter, can I ask you a question?" "Go on." "When's the last time somebody walked this ranch and wrote down what you've got instead of what you've lost?" William blinked. "What? You keep saying what you can't do, what you don't got. 52 days, no money, dying cattle." She leaned forward, and her voice took on something it hadn't had before. A low, quiet certainty, the sound of a person stepping onto ground she knew. "But I walked your pantry last night and found a week of meals folks had written off as garbage. I found coffee nobody reached for, and meal nobody sifted, and a bone bound for the dogs. If that's what's rotting in your pantry, sir, I'd like to know what is rotting in your fields." William stared at her. "You said the whole county's given up on you," Margaret said. "But I don't reckon you've walked this land looking for what's still good in a long, long while. You've been too busy burying it." The words landed harder than she likely knew. William thought of the rifle, of the 3 cattle, of 2 years of watching, waiting, counting down. "I grew up on a farm going under," Margaret said quieter now. "Watched my daddy lose it. Watched him do everything you're doing, count what was gone every night till he couldn't see nothing else. He gave up long before the bank ever took it. The land didn't kill that farm, Mr. Carter. The giving up did." She sat back. "I ain't asking for a wage. I ain't even asking to stay past your 52 days. I'm asking you to let me walk your ranch with a pencil and paper for 3 days, and write down everything you've still got, and then I'm asking you to look at that list before you decide it's over." The kitchen was silent. Out in the yard, a man called to another, and a horse stamped, and the ordinary sounds of a ranch that did not yet know it was dying went on around them. William Carter was a proud man. His father had been a proud man, and his father before him, and pride was about the only thing the bank hadn't found a way to take yet. Everything in him bristled at the idea a woman who'd shown up yesterday off a stranger's wagon telling him he'd given up on his own land. But she wasn't wrong. He knew she wasn't wrong, the same way he'd known that stew was different the second it touched his tongue. Some things a man recognized as true before he had time to argue with them. 3 days, he said. 3 days. And a pencil. And a pencil. "You find anything worth finding," William said slowly. "You come tell me. You don't find nothing you've cost me 3 days I didn't have. Either way, you'll have earned your keep, and I'll not have a soul on this place say Margaret Ellis ate for free." He stood. He put out his hand across the table. "That fair?" She looked at his hand. Then she rose, the chair scraping, and this time nobody was there to laugh, and William found he was glad of it, and she took his hand and shook it once firm as any man. "That's fair, Mr. Carter." "William." "Margaret." He nodded and picked up his hat and settled it on his head. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "That stew last night," he said. "First warm thing this house has had in it since my mother passed. I don't rightly know what to make of that a woman I don't know walking into my kitchen and making it smell like home. He set his jaw. But I know I'd near forgot what home smelled like. And I don't figure that's a small thing to have back. Not 52 days from losing all of it. He heard her behind him very quiet. No, William, she said. It ain't a small thing at all. He tipped his hat without looking back the way his father had taught him, and walked out into the hard, bright morning to find his men leaving Margaret Ellis standing in the kitchen of a dying ranch with a pencil she hadn't been handed yet, and a list she was already building in her head of every good thing a broken man had spent 2 years refusing to see. By the third day, Margaret Ellis had filled both sides of every sheet of paper William had given her, and then she had turned them sideways and filled the margins too. She found him at the north pens near dusk, where he was crouched beside the water trough, studying a crack in the wood that had been there so long he'd stopped seeing it. He heard her coming before he saw her the steady even fall of her step, and he didn't turn around. You've got that look, he said. What look? The look a horse trader gets right before he tells you your best animal's got a bad tooth. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. Go on then. Give it to me. Margaret held out the papers. He didn't take them. Just tell me, he said. I don't read numbers as good as I read faces, and I've been reading faces my whole life. Yours says you found something. I found a lot of things, William. Bad or good? Both. She lowered the papers. But I'll start with the good on account of you've been living in the bad so long you forgot the good's still standing. That's a fine speech. You practice it? Some, she admitted, and for the first time since she'd walked onto his land, he saw something in her face that might have been the ghost of a smile. It was gone quick, but he saw it. All right, he said. Good first. You've got 40 acres of bottomland along the East Creek that ain't been touched in years. Rich ground, black as coffee when you turn it over. Your daddy grew hay there by the look of the old fence line, and it'd grow hay again. That land floods. It floods 'cause the drainage cut your daddy dug filled in with silt. It ain't broke, it's just neglected. 2 weeks of work with the men you've got, and that 40 acres feeds every animal on this ranch through winter, and gives you a surplus to sell besides. She turned a page. You've been buying feed, William. I saw the receipts in the drawer. You've been paying good money out to keep cattle alive on grass. You could be growing yourself for the cost of some sweat. William was quiet a moment. Bill said that bottomland was worthless. Bill's a cattleman. He looks at land and sees grazing or he sees nothing. I look at it and see what my daddy taught me to see. She turned another page. You've got a spring house gone to ruin down by the old orchard. The orchard's half wild, but it's still bearing I counted apple pear and a stand of plum. Nobody's picked it in years. That fruit rots on the ground every fall, William. That's money rotting on the ground. Nobody's got time to pick fruit when the cattle are dying. Which is exactly why you're losing, Margaret said, and her voice sharpened just enough to make him look at her. Forgive me, but you keep pouring everything you've got into the one thing that's failing, and you keep letting everything that could save you rot in the dirt. That ain't ranching, William. That's a man drowning and swimming toward the anchor. The words hung in the air between them. William looked out at his land, the dry pens, the thin cattle, the fences he could not keep up. And then, past all of it toward the East Creek, he had not walked in more than a year. You said there was bad too, he said finally. There is. Then let's have it. Margaret was quiet. She squared the papers in her hands, and when she spoke her voice had gone careful again, the way it had that first night in the kitchen. Somebody's been stealing from you. William turned. What? Your feed receipts don't match your feed. You've been buying grain for 200 head. You've got maybe 140 left, and you've been down near that number for 4 months by the tally in your own ledger. But you're still paying for feed for 200. She held out a page. Somebody's ordering more than this ranch needs, and pocketing the difference, or selling it out the back, or both. I can't prove which. But the numbers don't lie, William. And the numbers say you're bleeding money out a hole that ain't got nothing to do with the drought. William took the paper this time. He held it close in the failing light. He was not a man who read numbers easy, But he could read these because she'd laid them out in two plain columns, what was bought and what was needed, and the gap between them was as wide as a grave. "That's 4 months," he said slowly. "At least. Could be longer. Ledger only goes back so far." 4 months. His jaw worked. "Who does the feed orders?" Margaret didn't answer. "Margaret, who signs for the feed?" "You know who," she said quietly. "You just don't want it to be true." And William did know. There was only one man on the place he'd trusted with the account, one man he'd handed the keys to when he got too tired and too heartsick to ride into Helena himself and stand in the feed store while men he'd known his whole life looked at him with pity. "Bill," he said. The name came out of him like something torn loose. "Bill Hutchins." "I ain't saying it's him for certain," Margaret said quickly. "I'm saying it's his signature on orders this ranch didn't need. I'm saying the money went somewhere. You're the one has to decide what that means, 'cause you know the man and I don't." But William had gone very still, and Margaret saw the thing she'd been dreading move across his face, not just anger, grief. The particular grief of a man who has just learned that the last person he trusted had a hand in his ruin. 9 years, William said. "That man's worked this land 9 years. Buried my father alongside me. Sat up 3 nights with me when the fever near took me in '81. His voice cracked and he mastered it. "And you're telling me he's been stealing feed out from under a dying ranch. I'm telling you the numbers don't lie. Men do." Margaret took a step toward him. "William, listen to me. I know how this sits. I know it feels like the ground gave out. But you can't fix a leak you won't look at. You've got 50 days left. You cannot afford to keep paying for feed you'll never see." 49, William said. "What? 50 days you keep saying. It's 49 now." He folded the paper and put it inside his coat next to the bank letter, so that both the deaths of his ranch rode together over his heart. "You've been on this land 3 days, Margaret Ellis. In 3 days, you've found me a hayfield, an orchard, and a thief. My own men have had years and found me nothing but reasons to quit. Your men are good men. They're just tired, and tired men stop seeing. You're tired too. You didn't sleep the first night, and I doubt you've slept much since walking this whole spread with a pencil." "I sleep when there's nothing left worth staying up for," Margaret said. "There's plenty here worth staying up for." William looked at her a long moment. The sun was going down behind her, and the light had gone red and long, and for just that moment the woman his hands had laughed at looked to him like the only solid thing standing on all his failing acres. "Come on," he said. "It's getting dark, and I got a man to talk to." She caught his arm. "Not tonight." "Why not tonight?" "Because you're angry, and an angry man asks the wrong questions and gets the wrong answers. You go at Bill tonight with your blood up, he'll dig in or he'll run. And either way, you lose the truth. Wait, watch. Let me find out where the feed's going first. Give me a week." "I don't have a week to give." "You don't have a night to waste getting it wrong either." Her grip on his arm was firm. "William, trust me one more time. I've been right so far." And that was the thing. She had been right so far, every single time. William let out a long breath. 1 week. 1 week. "And if you're wrong about Bill?" "If I'm wrong about Bill, I'll walk out your gate myself, and you'll never have to look on me again." She let go of his arm. "But I ain't wrong, William. I only wish I was." That night the stew was thicker with meat in it. William was fairly sure had come off the wild land she'd surveyed, snared, or shot. He didn't ask, and the men ate it the way they'd eaten every meal since she came, like men remembering they were alive. And William sat at the head of his own table and watched Bill Hutchins laugh at something Tom said, watch the man wipe his mouth and lean back and look for all the world like a loyal foreman easing after an honest day. And William thought, "I have known you 9 years, and I do not know you at all," and it near choked him. He said nothing. He was learning from a woman with a pencil how to wait. The week that followed was the longest of William Carter's life, and the strangest, because in the middle of watching his oldest friend for signs of betrayal, he watched his dying ranch begin impossibly to come back to life. It started with the men. Margaret had a way with them. William couldn't have managed if he'd tried for a year. She didn't order, she didn't beg. She fed them first, till they'd have followed her anywhere, and then she asked small things at first. Would Tom mind clearing the silt from the old drainage cut, seeing as he was young and strong, and it'd take a young back? Would Pete, who'd been on the land longest, walk her out to the orchard and tell her which trees his own father had planted? Would Dell? And here she looked, the mean-mouthed boy dead in the eye. Would Dell be willing to prove he was as much a hand as he claimed by taking the worst job of all, hauling stone to shore up the springhouse? Why me? Dell had demanded. Because you talk the biggest? Margaret said, plain as day, and I'd like to see if the work matches the mouth. I'm hoping it does. A ranch this size can use a man who's as strong as he says he is. The men had laughed at Dell this time, not at her, and Dell had gone red, and then because he was 19, and full of spite and pride in equal measure, he'd hauled stone from dawn to dark for 3 days, just to spite her. And by the end of it, the springhouse stood, and Dell walked different. And he never laughed at Margaret Ellis again. You handled that boy neat, William told her. That boy ain't mean, Margaret said. He's scared. Scared boys puff up. You give 'em something hard to do, and let 'em do it, they got no more need to. You learned that off your daddy, too. I learned that off being the girl everybody laughed at, she said, and went back to her kettle, and William did not ask her anything else about it, because there was a door in her voice that had closed, and he knew better than to push on a closed door. The bottomland came next. William took 6 men, and they cleared the drainage cut. Margaret had found 2 weeks of work she'd promised, though, with the men working like they hadn't worked in a year. They did it in 9 days. And when the water ran clear and true down the old channel for the first time in a decade, William stood at the head of that 40 acres of black bottomland and felt something he was frightened to name. It'll grow hay by August, Margaret said beside him. Enough to winter every head you've got and more to sell. If I still own it by August. You'll own it. She said it flat certain. One thing at a time, William. You keep looking at 49 days like it's a wall. It ain't a wall. It's a list. And we're crossing things off it. 49 had become 42. And on the 6th day of the week, she'd asked for Margaret Ellis found where the feed was going. She came to William, not at the pens this time, but in the barn, where he was working alone by lantern light, and she shut the door behind her, which she had never done, and William knew before she said a word that the waiting was over. I followed Bill into Helena, she said. You did what? Yesterday, when you sent him for the mail. I hitched a ride into town on the back of the Petersons' wagon, and I watched him. Her voice was low and fast. He didn't go to the feed store, William. He went to the cattleman's bank, went in the front and stayed near an hour. And when he came out, he had money on him. I saw him count it in the alley behind the mercantile before he put it away. William set down the harness he'd been mending. The bank. The same bank that's fixing to take your land. Bill went to the bank. William's mind was moving slow, like a man wading upstream. Bill's been stealing feed money and taking it to the bank. No. Margaret shook her head hard. That's what I thought too. But it don't fit. A thief don't march into the bank in broad daylight and count his stolen money in an alley. That's not a man hiding. That's a man doing business. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped even lower. William, I don't think Bill's stealing from you for himself. I think somebody's paying him. Paying him for what? To bleed you. The word landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. Think on it. The feed order's too big. The money gone. Your account draining faster than the drought alone could drain it. And now Bill walking out of the very bank that holds your note with cash in his pocket. She held his eyes. Somebody wants this ranch to fail on schedule, William. Somebody wants to be dead certain you can't make that payment. And they got to your foreman to make sure of it. The barn was silent, but for the guttering lantern. Somebody wants my land, William said slowly. Somebody wants your land bad enough to pay for it twice, once to ruin you, and once to buy it cheap off the bank after. And the man they bought to do it has been sitting at your table 9 years. William Carter had been beaten down by 2 years of drought and debt and death, and he had borne all of it with the stubborn silence of a man who believed he had earned his ruin. But this was different. This was a hand at his throat that he had not seen, a betrayal dressed as loyalty, and something in him that had been lying down for 2 years stood up. "Who?" he said. His voice had gone very quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted. "Who wants my land?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." William. "You found the hayfield in 3 days. You found the orchard. You found the thief. You found where the money went." He stepped toward her, and there was a fire in him now. She hadn't seen the fire of the man he must have been before the land started dying the strongest man in the county. "You find out who's behind it, Margaret. Because if a man's paying to take everything my father built, then he's going to look me in the eye while he does it. I'll not lose this ranch to a shadow. And Bill." The fire in William flickered. 9 years. The fever nights. His father's grave. "Bill," he said, and stopped. He was quiet a long moment. "Say nothing to Bill. Change nothing. He can't know we know." His jaw tightened. "Let him think it's working. Let him think I'm beat. A man who thinks he's already won gets careless, and I want him careless. I want to know every name he answers to before I so much as look at him crossways." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's cold, William. You told me an angry man asks the wrong questions." He turned back to the harness. "I'm learning to wait. You taught me that. Now teach me the rest." And so the strangest part of it began. Because for the next many days, William Carter sat at his own table across from the man who was helping bury him, and smiled and said nothing, and let Bill Hutchins believe the ranch was dying right on time. It near killed him. Margaret could see it. Every meal, every morning, William would clap Bill on the shoulder and ask after the feed and let the man lie to his face. And every night William's knuckles would be white around his coffee cup, and only Margaret knew why. "You're doing right," she told him one night after the men had gone to their bunks. "I'm doing something I hate." "Right and easy ain't the same road. You'd have learned that by now running this place." "I learned it," William said heavily. "I just forgot I knew it, same as I forgot everything else worth knowing till you walked in with a wooden spoon and reminded me." He looked at her across the kitchen. "How is it you see so clear, Margaret? A man could go blind staring at his own troubles. You walked in fresh and saw everything I couldn't." "That's easy," she said. "It ain't my trouble. When it's your own, you can't step back far enough to see the shape of it. When it's somebody else's, you can see it whole." She wiped down the last of the pots. "That's why folks like me are worth something to folks like you, if folks like you'd ever look past the outside long enough to find out. Folks like you. Big women who show up off wagons," she said, not bitter, just plain. "The kind men laugh at. The kind of woman a man like you almost turned away at the door." She hung the rag to dry. "I heard you that first night. Bill telling you they weren't hiring. I stood in that corner and waited for you to send me down the road with the rest of them. Every place I ever stopped sent me down the road." William was quiet. "Why didn't I?" "You know why." "The stew." "The stew." She almost smiled again. "Funny thing to be saved by. A pot of scraps. Wasn't the stew that saved me?" William said, and the words came out before he'd decided to say them. Margaret went still. "It was that you stepped forward. Every man at that table looked at his plate, and a woman who'd been laughed at her whole life, who had every reason in this world to keep her head down, stepped out of the corner and said, 'I did, sir.'" He shook his head slow. "I'd near forgot what it looked like, somebody standing up straight in front of me. My men had all learned to duck. My friend was robbing me blind. And here comes a stranger standing up straight, telling the truth to a man holding a rifle. That's what saved me, Margaret. Wasn't the stew, was the standing up." The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret Ellis had been called many things in her life, most of them cruel, and she had learned to let them run off her like rain off a slicker. But she had not been ready for this, for a proud man to look at her across a lamplit kitchen and tell her that her worth was in her spine and not the size of her, and for a moment she could not find her voice at all. "You'd best get to bed," she said finally low. "Morning comes early. Margaret." "Good night, William." She went to her little room off the kitchen and shut the door, and William sat alone at the table a long while, turning his coffee cup in his hands, wondering at himself. He did not know it, but two things happened that night that would change everything. The first was that Margaret Ellis, lying awake in the cook's old room, let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feel something dangerous. Hope, maybe. Or something warmer than hope, and worse, because hope you could survive losing, and this other thing you could not, and she had learned long ago never to want what she could not survive losing. She lay in the dark and told herself firmly that she was a hired woman on a dying ranch, and William Carter was a landowner grieving his losses, and that a big woman who'd been laughed at from Ohio to Montana had no business letting her heart get above her station. And she believed all of it. And it did not help at all. The second thing was that Bill Hutchins, walking back late from the outhouse, saw the lantern still burning in the kitchen and stopped and watched through the window as William and Margaret talked. He could not hear the words, but he saw William's face, the way the man leaned toward the woman, the way the hardness had gone out of him. And Bill Hutchins, who had convinced himself that what he was doing was just business, that the ranch was dead anyway, and a man had to look after his own future, felt the first cold finger of fear touch the back of his neck, because a beaten man was easy to bury. But William Carter did not look beaten anymore. Bill went to his bunk and lay awake, and in the morning he did a thing he had not done in weeks. He looked hard at the ranch on his way to the pens, really looked, and he saw the clear water running down the old drainage cut, and the 6 men working the bottomland with their backs straight, and the smoke rising steady from the kitchen, where a woman was turning scraps into strength. And Bill Hutchins understood with a sick lurch that the ranch he'd been paid to bury was not dying anymore, which meant somebody was going to be very unhappy with him, which meant Bill Hutchins had a decision to make. He made the wrong one. It was Margaret who caught it first 3 days later, and she caught it because she had never once in her life stopped watching the people who thought she wasn't worth watching. The feed orders changed, she told William. They were at the bottomland fence where the first green of the new hay was pushing up through the black soil, and William had been standing there just looking at it, the way a man looks at a thing he'd given up ever seeing again. Changed how? Smaller. Bill cut it near in half. First honest order he signed in months. She kept her voice down, though there was no one near. He stopped stealing, William. That's good, ain't it? No. Margaret shook her head. It's the worst thing that could have happened. A thief who keeps stealing is a thief who thinks nobody's watching. A thief who suddenly stops is a thief who got scared. Bill knows something's wrong. He's covering his tracks. William's face darkened. You think he's onto us? I think he's onto something. Maybe he saw us talking. Maybe he just felt the ranch turning under his feet and got spooked. She looked at William. Either way, our week of waiting just ran out. If Bill's scared, Bill's dangerous. A scared man does one of two things. He runs, or he does something desperate to finish the job before he's caught. And even as she said it, they both turned, because a rider was coming up the ranch road at a hard gallop, and William put his hand above his eyes and saw it was young Tom, riding like the devil was on him. Tom hauled up in a cloud of dust. Mr. Carter, you gotta come. It's the north pasture. It's the cattle. What about the cattle? The gate's open, wide open, and there's tracks. Somebody drove 'em out in the night, near 40 head, drove 'em straight toward the river breaks where we'll never find 'em all. Tom fought for breath. And Bill's gone, sir. Bill Hutchins is gone. Took a horse and his kit and rode out before light. He's gone. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then William Carter closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the fire was back banked hot and steady, and Margaret saw the strongest man in the county standing where the beaten rancher had been. 40 head, William said. Near about. Toward the river breaks. Yes, sir. William turned to Margaret. How long can a man drive 40 head before he's got to rest 'em? Margaret's mind was already moving, already doing the thing she did, seeing the shape of the whole trouble at once. Cattle driven hard in the dark won't make good time. He'd have had to slow near the brakes, or lose half of 'em to broke legs on that ground. If he left before light, he's maybe 8-10 miles out, and he's moving slow. She looked at William. You could catch him. If you left now and rode hard, and knew the country better than he does. I was born in that country. William swung up onto Tom's horse before the boy had half dismounted. Tom, get every man that can ride. Bring rope and bring rifles. Margaret. Go, she said. I'll hold the ranch. Go get your cattle. But William didn't go, not yet. He looked down at her from the horse, and there was something in his face she'd never seen, something that frightened her and thrilled her in the same breath. He didn't just steal my cattle, William said. He stole 'em 3 weeks before my payments due, when I need every head to make the note. This wasn't Bill running scared. This was Bill doing his job. Somebody told him to finish it. His jaw set. You find out who while I'm gone, Margaret. You find out who's paying to bury me. Because I'm going to bring my cattle home, and then I'm going to find the man behind all this, and God help him when I do. He wheeled the horse and was gone. And the last thing Margaret Ellis heard was his voice carrying back across the yard, hard and clear and alive, calling his men to the chase. She stood alone at the bottomland fence, watching the dust of them dwindle toward the river breaks. And then she turned back toward the house, and she did not run, because Margaret Ellis had never in her life been able to run. But she walked with a purpose that was faster than most men's running, because she had a ranch to hold and a mystery to solve, and 41 days to save a good man's home, and she had never once, not from Ohio, to Kansas, to Montana, backed down from a hard thing in her life. She would not start now. The men were gone near 2 days. They were the 2 longest days of Margaret's life, longer even than the walking days, longer than the days after her daddy lost the farm. Because there was nothing to do but hold the ranch and wait and turn the thing over and over in her mind. Who wanted the land? Who'd paid Bill? Who stood to gain from William Carter's ruin? And in those 2 days, working the answer like a woman worrying a knot, she found her first real thread, and it came from the last place she expected. It came from the ledger. She'd been through the ledger a dozen times for the feed numbers, but now she went through it different looking, not for what Bill had stolen, but for who Bill had done business with, and there, buried in the accounts from the previous fall, she found a name that did not belong. A payment. Not to a feed supplier, not to any account she recognized, just a name and a figure in Bill's cramped hand. H. Calloway. Margaret sat back. She knew that name. She'd heard it since she'd heard the men say it, heard it in town, when she'd followed Bill. Calloway. Horace Calloway. The biggest cattleman in the county, the man whose spread bordered Carter land on the west, the man who'd been buying up every failing ranch for 40 miles as the drought broke smaller men. The man Margaret realized whose grazing would double if he could just get his hands on the Carter bottomland and the river access that came with it. The bottomland William hadn't even known was worth anything. The bottomland Margaret had brought back to life in 3 weeks. Horace Calloway didn't want a dying ranch. Horace Calloway wanted the water, and a payment in Bill Hutchins' own hand, a year old, tied the 2 men together tight as a hangman's knot. Margaret's hands were shaking when she closed the ledger. Not from fear, from the terrible cold certainty of a person who has just seen the whole shape of a thing at last and understood how close it had come to working. She had it. She had the name. She had the proof. Now she just needed William to come home alive to hear it. He came home on the second evening, and he came home with his cattle. She heard them before she saw them. The lowing of the herd, and she came out of the kitchen and stood in the yard as they drove them up the ranch road in the last of the light. 40 head near, about thin and spooked and footsore but alive. And behind them, the men filthy and exhausted and grinning like men who had ridden into hell and dragged something back out of it. And at the head of them on Tom's borrowed horse was William Carter. And across the saddle in front of him, wrists bound with rope, sat Bill Hutchins. They'd caught him. They'd caught the cattle, and they'd caught the man. William rode into the yard and stopped, and for a long moment he and Margaret just looked at each other across the dust and the milling cattle, and neither one said a word, because there was too much to say and no way to say it in front of the men. Then William swung down. He hauled Bill off the horse none too gentle and stood him up in the yard, and the men gathered round, and William Carter looked at the foreman, who'd served him 9 years, who'd buried his father with him, who'd sat up through the fever nights, and his voice when it came was quiet and terrible. 9 years, Bill. Bill Hutchins wouldn't meet his eyes. I want to hear you say it, William said. In front of these men, I want to hear you say why. And Bill Hutchins, who had been caught and bound and driven 2 days across hard country, who had nothing left to lose, and knew it, finally lifted his head and looked at William Carter. And there was shame in his face. And under the shame, something worse. The tired, sick look of a man who'd told himself so many times that he had no choice, that he'd come to believe it. You want the truth, Bill said. The truth is, your ranch was dead, William. It was dead a year ago and everybody knew it but you. I got a wife back in Missouri I ain't seen in 3 years, and a debt of my own. I never told you about, and along comes a man who says, the Carter place is finished anyhow, so why not take a little something for helping it along quicker? Why not look after your own self for once, instead of going down with a ship that's already sinking? His voice cracked. That's the truth. I told myself it didn't matter 'cause you were finished anyhow. I told myself that every single day. And the man who paid you, William said, the man who said all that, you going to give me his name? Bill went pale. His name, Bill. You don't understand what he is, Bill whispered. You give up his name, and he'll... Calloway, Margaret said. Every head turned. Margaret stood on the kitchen steps with the ledger in her hands, and she came down into the yard, slow and steady, and she held William's eyes. Horace Calloway, she said. It's in your own books, William. A payment to Bill in Calloway's account a year back. Calloway's been paying your foreman to bleed you dry since before the drought ever got bad. She looked at Bill, and there was no cruelty in it, only a terrible clear pity. He don't want your dying ranch, William. He wants your water. That bottomland I brought back the creek, the river access that's worth more to Horace Calloway than every cow you own. He's been buying up failed spreads for 40 miles. And yours is the one he wants most, and he got to your foreman a year ago to make sure the bank took it before you ever figured out what you were sitting on. The yard was dead silent. Even the cattle had gone quiet. William Carter looked at the ledger in Margaret's hands, and then at Bill Hutchins, standing bound and broken in the dust, and then out toward the west, toward the Calloway spread that bordered his own, and Margaret watched the last piece of it settle into place behind his eyes. That's why, William said slowly. That's why he never made me an offer straight. A man that rich, he could have bought me out honest any day these 2 years. But an honest sale, I'd have got a fair price. He didn't want to pay a fair price. His hands closed into fists. He wanted to pay pennies to the bank after they took it. He wanted me ruined, not bought. He wanted me to lose everything so he could have it for nothing. Yes, Margaret said quietly. He paid my own friend to do it. Yes. William stood there a long moment, and Margaret could see the grief and the rage warring in him, and she did not know which would win, and it frightened her, because a man with rage like that could ruin himself worse than any bank ever could. Then William Carter did something that surprised her. He turned to Bill Hutchins, and the rage went out of his voice, and what was left was only tired and sad and human. Untie him, William said. The men stared. Boss, Tom said. Untie him. William held Bill's eyes. You did me a wrong, Bill, that I don't know as I'll ever forgive. You took the bread out of my men's mouths and the cattle off my land. And you did it for a man who'd have paid your own children pennies for their inheritance if it suited him. I ought to turn you over to the marshal and let you hang for cattle theft, and by rights I would. Bill was shaking. But you're going to do something for me instead, William said. You're going to go to Helena, and you're going to swear out everything you just told me in front of a lawyer and a judge, every dollar Calloway paid you, every feed order, you faked every last thing. You're going to put Horace Calloway's crime on paper where it can't be buried. His voice hardened. You do that, and you ride out of this territory, and never let me see your face again, and we'll call your debt to me paid. You don't, and I hand you to the marshal tonight. That's the only mercy you'll get from me, Bill, and it's more than you gave." And Bill Hutchins, weeping, now nodded, and the men untied him, and it was done. Later, much later, when the cattle were penned and the men fed, and Bill Hutchins locked in the barn under Pete's watchful eye to be taken to Helena, come morning, William found Margaret in the kitchen, and he sat down heavy at the table, and he put his face in his hands. Margaret said nothing. She poured coffee. She set it in front of him. She sat down across the table, and she waited, because she'd learned that a man carrying a weight like that had to set it down in his own time. "He's going to fight it," William said finally into his hands. "Calloway? Even with Bill's word on paper, a man that rich, that powerful, he's got lawyers, he's got the bank in his pocket, he's got half the county owing him money. Bill's word against Horace Calloway's. Who do you think a Helena judge believes? Bill's word ain't all we've got," Margaret said. William looked up. "There's the ledger, there's the feed receipts, there's the payment in Calloway's own account." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "And there's one thing more, William, that I ain't told you yet, 'cause I only found it while you were gone, and I wanted to be sure." "Tell me." Margaret was quiet a moment. Then she said, "The land Calloway wants. The bottom land, the water. I went back through your daddy's old papers, the ones in the trunk in the attic, looking for anything that'd help." She leaned forward. "William, your daddy filed a water right on that creek, 30 years ago. It's registered in Helena in the territorial records in your family name. It's yours by law, going back to before Horace Calloway ever set foot in this county. So Calloway can't touch that water, not by buying your land off the bank, not anyway. That water right's attached to your family, not just your deed. Even if he took the ranch, he couldn't take the water without your name on a paper saying he could." Her eyes were bright. "That's why he needed you ruined, not bought. If he bought you fair, you might have held back the water right. He had to break you so bad you'd sign anything just to walk away with the clothes on your back. That was the plan. William. Grind you down till you'd give up the one thing worth having just to be free of the rest." William stared at her. "But you didn't give up," Margaret said softly. "You held on 3 weeks too long. And now you know. And a man who knows what he's holding, don't let it go cheap." For a long moment William Carter could not speak. Then he reached across the table, and he took Margaret Ellis's hand in both of his, calloused and rough and shaking just slightly, and he held it, and Margaret let him, though her heart was pounding fit to break. "You walked onto this ranch 3 weeks ago," William said low, "with nothing but a wooden spoon and a body folks laughed at, and in 3 weeks you found me a hayfield and an orchard and a thief and a traitor and the name of the man behind all of it, and a water right my own daddy filed before I was grown." His voice broke. "There's not a man in this county could have done what you've done. Not Bill, not me, not Horace Calloway with all his money. You saw everything the rest of us were too proud, or too tired, or too blind to see." "William, I almost turned you away," he said. "At my own door. I stood there with a rifle in my hand, and I almost sent you down the road like every fool before me. And you'd have gone, and I'd never have known. I'd have lost this ranch and my daddy's water and everything, and I'd never once have known that the woman who could have saved all of it was standing in my kitchen the whole time." He shook his head, and there were tears standing in his eyes, this hard, proud man, and he didn't wipe them away. How many times, Margaret? How many times did that happen? How many men turned away the one person who could have saved them just 'cause of how she was made? Margaret Ellis, who had been laughed at from Ohio to Montana, who had learned to stand in the corners where it was safe, who had told herself just nights ago that a woman like her had no business wanting anything. Above her station, looked at the rancher holding her hand across his lamplit table, and felt the thing she'd sworn she couldn't survive losing, and knew it was already too late to protect herself from it. "Every day, William," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "It happens every single day, all over this country. Good folks turned away at good men's doors for nothing but the outside of them. She held his eyes. But not every man opens the door back up. Not every man looks again. She managed something close to a smile. You looked again. That's the whole of it. That's what saved you, not me. You looked again when every other fool wouldn't. And William Carter, 3 weeks from losing everything, holding the hand of the woman who'd shown him how to save it, understood that whatever came next, the fight with Calloway, the ride to Helena, the payment coming due, he was not going to face it beaten. He was not going to face it alone. And for the first time since they'd lowered his father into the ground, William Carter felt all the way down to the bottom of his tired heart like a man with a fighting chance. Come morning, he said, we ride to Helena. Both of us. We put Bill's word and your ledger and my daddy's water right in front of the judge, and we bring the whole thing down on Horace Calloway's head. Come morning, Margaret agreed. But morning was still hours off, and there was a rich and powerful man not 5 miles to the west who did not yet know that his year-long plan had just come apart in a dying rancher's kitchen, and who would, before this was finished, do everything in his considerable power to make sure that Ledger never reached a Helena judge alive. They never made it to Helena the way they'd planned. The trouble came at 3 in the morning, and it came the way trouble always came to men like Horace Calloway, quiet and sure, and wearing another man's face. It was Pete who woke them. Old Pete, who never talked, hammering on the kitchen door with the flat of his hand, and his voice cracking out of him rough with disuse. Fire, William, get up. There's fire in the barn. William came off his cot in the back room, already reaching for his boots, and Margaret was up before him, because Margaret had learned long ago to sleep light in strange houses, and the two of them met in the kitchen in the dark, and William had his hand on the door when Margaret caught his arm. Wait, there's fire in my... Bill's in that barn. Her grip was iron. Bill Hutchins is locked in that barn, William, and the one thing on this ranch that Horace Calloway needs dead more than your cattle is the man who can testify against him. She held his eyes in the dark. That fire ain't an accident. And it ain't meant to burn your barn. It's meant to burn your witness. For one terrible second William understood, and the understanding near stopped his heart. Then he was through the door and running. The barn was burning from the back from the hayside, and Pete was already there with a bucket and Tom and Dell in his union suit throwing dirt with his bare hands, and William could hear it now, over the roar of it, a man screaming. Bill Hutchins locked in the tack room at the front of the barn screaming for his life, while the fire ate its way toward him. The key, William shouted. Pete, the key, where's the key? Boss, I gave it to you, you had it. And William slapped at his own pockets, and it wasn't there. And he understood in a sick lurch that it had been lifted off him in the night, which meant somebody had been in the house, which meant this was closer and colder than even Margaret had guessed. Break it down. William grabbed an axe off the wall and swung it at the tack room door, once, twice, the wood splitting, the smoke pouring out thick and black, and behind it Bill screaming and coughing, and William swung again and the door gave, and he plunged into the smoke and dragged the man out by his collar, both of them falling into the dirt, Bill retching alive. Alive, but barely. They saved the man. They did not save the barn. By the time the sun came up, the whole structure was a black smoking ruin, and with it 2 horses. They hadn't gotten out in time, and near half the winter feed Margaret had so carefully husbanded. And William Carter stood in the gray dawn light, looking at the smoking bones of it, and felt the rage in him build to something he could hardly hold. But it was Margaret who said the thing that mattered. She'd been going over the ground the way she did reading it, like she read the ledgers, and she came to William with something in her hand, and her face gone hard. This wasn't meant to look like an accident, she said. Look. She opened her hand. A coil of fuse, cut clean, store-bought. Somebody laid a fuse to the hay and lit it and walked away, she said. This was a man who wanted Bill dead and wanted us to know it was no accident. This was a message, William. Calloway's telling you he knows you've got Bill's confession, and he's telling you what happens to men who cross him. She closed her hand around the fuse. Which means he knows. Which means somebody told him. Which means there's another one. William said slowly. "Another man of his here on my ranch. Right now. One who took the key off me in the night and lit that fuse and is standing in this yard pretending to help throw dirt on the fire he set." The two of them turned slow and looked at the men. Pete, black to the elbows with soot bent over, gasping. Tom, his eyebrows singed clean off his young face, streaked with tears and smoke. Dell, barefoot and bleeding where he'd beaten at the flames with his bare hands. And Bill Hutchins, half dead in the dirt, the man they'd just pulled from the fire. 4 men. And one of them Margaret knew, with cold certainty, had tried to burn a man alive in the night. "It ain't Pete," William said low. "Pete's been with my family 30 years. It ain't Tom," Margaret said. "That boy's near a child. And it ain't Bill, he'd not burn himself alive." Which left one. William's eyes went to Dell. Dell, the mean-mouthed boy who'd laughed at Margaret that first night. Dell, who'd showed up on the ranch not 8 months back, right around the time Margaret realized with a lurch that Bill's feed orders had started climbing. Dell, who'd taken to the springhouse work like a man with something to prove, who'd stopped laughing at Margaret, who'd seemed to change. "No," Margaret said suddenly. "No, what? It's not him." She grabbed William's arm as he started toward the boy. "William, wait, think. If Dell was Calloway's man, why'd he tear his own hands up beating out that fire? Look at him. That's not a man play acting. That boy near killed himself trying to put it out." She shook her head hard. "A guilty man throws a little dirt and stands back. Dell fought that fire like it was his own house burning. It ain't Dell." William stopped. "Then who?" And that was the question that turned everything cold, because if it wasn't Pete, and it wasn't Tom, and it wasn't Bill, and it wasn't Dell, then it wasn't any of the men in the yard at all. "Somebody who ain't here," William said slowly. "Somebody who lit it and rode off before Pete woke." "Or somebody," Margaret said, and her voice had gone very quiet, "who was never one of your men to begin with." She was looking past the ruined barn now toward the ranch road, and William followed her gaze. And in the gray dawn, they both saw it. At the same time, a horse and rider coming up the road unhurried. A man in a good coat on a good animal riding toward them, like a man paying a neighborly call. "That's a fine morning to be out riding," William said low and dangerous. The rider came on, and as he drew close they could see he was smiling, a big, easy smile under a gray mustache. A heavy man, prosperous. The kind of man who'd never in his life gone hungry, or been laughed at, or stood in a corner where it was safe. Horace Calloway reined up at the edge of the yard, and he looked at the smoking ruin of the barn, and he shook his head slow, and he said, "William Carter, I heard you had some trouble in the night. Rode over soon as I got word. Anything I can do." And there it was. The gall of it. The pure cold gall of the man riding up not 2 hours after his fuse had done its work to look at the ashes and offer his help. William took a step toward him. Margaret's hand shot out and caught his sleeve. "Word," she murmured. "He got word. William, it's near dawn. Your barn's been burning maybe 3 hours. Who rode to Calloway in the dark to tell him? Who left this ranch in the middle of the night to carry word to a man 5 miles west?" Her fingers dug into his arm. "That's your man. Whoever left to fetch Calloway. That's your traitor. And he ain't back yet, which means he's still... Miss Ellis, ain't it?" They both froze. Calloway was looking at Margaret. Looking right at her, that easy smile still on his face, and there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there a moment before, something that made Margaret's blood go to ice. "I've heard about you," Horace Calloway said pleasantly. "The cook. The big gal come off a wagon. They say you've been real busy since you got here, Miss Ellis. Real busy. Poking through ledgers, following honest men into town, digging in old trunks." His smile widened. "Word travels out here. A man hears things." Margaret's mouth had gone dry, because there was only one way Horace Calloway could know she'd followed Bill into Helena, or gone through the trunk in the attic, or read the ledgers. Only one way. Somebody had told him. Somebody who'd watched her do all of it and carried the tale west. And that somebody she understood now with a horror that near buckled her knees had been watching her every move for days. "You've been in my house," she said. "Ma'am, you've had a man in this house, watching me, watching all of us." She was speaking fast now, the pieces slamming together. "How else would you know what I read, what I looked for, where I went? You've had eyes on this ranch the whole time." She turned to William, gripping his arm. "William, it's not one of the men who left in the night. It's worse. It's somebody who's been here all along, reporting to Calloway every single thing we—" And then she stopped, because a memory had surfaced, sharp and sudden. The first night, the stew, the men at the table. 11 men she'd counted. 11 learned their 11 names. Bill, Tom, Pete, Dell, and 7 others. 7 hired hands who'd drifted through the edges of the story, who'd worked the bottomland and cleared the drainage cut and thrown dirt on fires. 7 men she'd never once suspected, because they were just hands. Just the faceless labor of a ranch. And she had made the oldest mistake there was, the very mistake that had been made against her 1,000 times. She had not looked at them. She had done to those 7 men exactly what the world had always done to her. She'd looked at what they were, hired hands, background, no account, and she hadn't looked at who they were. And one of them had been Horace Calloway's man, the whole time standing at her elbow, eating her stew, watching her read the ledgers. And she'd never once seen him, because she'd never once looked. "Oh, God," Margaret whispered. "Miss Ellis." Calloway's smile never wavered. "You've gone pale. You feeling poorly?" "Get off my land," William said. Calloway turned that easy smile on him. "Now, William, that's no way to talk to a neighbor come to offer help in your hour of—" "You lit that barn!" William's voice was shaking with the effort of holding still. "You paid my foreman for a year to bleed me dry. You put a man in my house to spy on my kitchen. And you rode up here this morning to smile at the ashes." He took a step forward, and this time Margaret did not stop him. "I know all of it, Calloway. Every dollar you paid Bill. The water right you're after. The plan to grind me down till I'd sign away my daddy's creek for nothing. I know all of it, and it's on paper, and come tomorrow it's in front of a Helena judge." For just a moment, just one, the easy smile flickered on Horace Calloway's face. Then it came back wider than before, and that was the most frightening thing of all, because a man who could smile after what William had just said was a man who did not believe for 1 second that any of it would ever reach a judge. "On paper," Calloway said softly. "Well now, that's real interesting, William. Real interesting." He gathered his reins. "You know what I've learned in 30 years of building what I've built, paper burns." His eyes flicked just once toward the smoking barn. "And men change their stories, and a rich man's word carries a long way in a Helena courtroom, longer than the word of a thief you caught rustling your own cattle, longer than the ledgers of a cook nobody's ever heard of." He settled his hat. "You want to bring your paper to town? You bring it. But you ought to know, William, a whole lot can happen to a man on the road between here and Helena. It's a long ride, lonesome country." He smiled down at Margaret. "Especially for folks who ain't built for hard travel." And with that, Horace Calloway tipped his hat, wheeled his fine horse, and rode back down the ranch road at the same unhurried pace he'd come, leaving the threat hanging in the air behind him, thick as the smoke. Nobody moved until he was gone. Then William turned to Margaret, and his face was gray. "He's going to kill us on the road." "He's going to try," Margaret said. And to her own surprise, her voice was steady, because the fear had burned through her and out the other side, and what was left underneath was something harder. "He as good as told us. He's got men, and he's got the road watched, and he thinks a rancher and a fat cook can't get a ledger 50 miles to Helena past whatever he's got waiting for us. Then we don't take the road." "No." Margaret shook her head slowly. "We don't take the road, and we don't take the ledger." William stared at her. "Margaret, the ledger's the whole—" "The ledger's what he expects. The ledger's what he's watching for." Her mind was racing now faster than it had ever gone, the whole shape of the trap laid out before her, and the one narrow way through it. He's got the road watched for 2 people carrying papers to Helena. So we give him 2 people carrying papers to Helena. She grabbed William's hands. And we send the real proof another way with somebody nobody's watching on a road nobody's guarding. Who every man on this place is known to Calloway. He's had a spy here for months. He knows all our faces. Not all of them. Margaret's eyes were bright. There's one person on this ranch Horace Calloway don't reckon as a person at all. One person he looked at this very morning and saw nothing but a big gal off a wagon not built for hard travel. She lifted her chin. Me? No. William. No, I am not sending you across 50 miles of Calloway's country alone. Absolutely not. It's the last thing he'd do, Margaret cut in. Listen to me. You're the one he watches. You're the rancher, the man with everything to lose. When you ride for Helena tomorrow with a satchel of papers and Bill Hutchins beside you, every eye Calloway's got will be on you. He'll throw everything he has at that road at you because you're the threat. She squeezed his hands hard. And while every one of his men is watching William Carter ride into a trap, a big cook nobody's ever noticed will already be halfway to Helena, on a mule going the long way round through country. A man like Calloway would never think to watch carrying the real ledger and your daddy's water right in a flour sack. Her voice dropped. He looked right at me this morning, William, and he called me a woman not built for hard travel. He don't see me. That's the one weakness a man like that's got. He can't see anybody he's decided don't matter. And that blindness is going to be the thing that hangs him. William Carter looked at her for a long, long moment. And Margaret watched the fear war with the sense of it in his face, the terror of sending her into danger against the cold hard logic that it was the only way through. If he catches you, William said low, he'll kill you, Margaret. He won't hesitate. A man who'd burn Bill alive. He won't catch me, Margaret said, because catching me would mean seeing me first. And Horace Calloway has never once in his life truly seen a woman like me. She almost smiled. It's the story of my whole life, William. Being looked at and not seen. Every place that ever turned me away, every man that ever laughed. I spent 32 years being invisible to men who thought they were better than me. She held his eyes. Let it be worth something finally. Let it save this ranch. Let the thing they use to hurt me be the thing that beats the man who'd take everything from you. And William Carter, who 3 weeks before had almost turned this woman away at his door, understood at last exactly what he had almost thrown away, and it broke something open in him. When this is over, he said, his voice rough, when Calloway's finished and the ranch is saved and you're back home safe, I've got things to say to you, Margaret Ellis. Things I ought to have said already. Things a man's a fool to leave unsaid. He gripped her hands. So you come back. You hear me? Whatever happens on that road, you come back to me because I've got things to say, and I mean to say them to your face. Margaret Ellis, who had never once in her life had a man ask her to come back to anything, felt her throat close and she could only nod. I'll come back, she managed. You just make sure you don't get yourself killed being the bait, William Carter, or there won't be nobody here for me to come back to. They left before dawn the next morning, the two of them in 2 different directions. William rode out the front gate at first light, loud and unmistakable, with Bill Hutchins beside him, and a leather satchel across his saddle stuffed with papers, and Dell and Tom flanking them armed to the teeth. And they took the Helena road straight and open, a rancher riding to town to fight for his land, exactly the thing Horace Calloway was watching for. And an hour before that, in the pitch dark, a heavy woman on a sure-footed mule had slipped out the back of the ranch through the orchard and gone south away from Helena, the long way round, with a flour sack tied to her saddle, and inside it a ledger and a 30-year-old water right, and the only real proof in the world that could bring Horace Calloway down. Margaret rode alone into country she didn't know, on a mule she half trusted, carrying the fate of a good man's home in a sack of flour. And she was more frightened than she had ever been in her life, and she did not turn back. The trap sprang on William at the river ford, just as Margaret had known it would. They were 6 men waiting, Calloway's men strung out through the willows on both sides of the crossing, where the road pinched down to a single track. And they had rifles, and they had the drop, and they meant business. William saw the first of them a half-second before the man meant him to, only because Margaret had drilled it into him, watch the birds. She'd said birds don't sit quiet with armed men in the brush, and he'd seen a whole willow gone silent and known. "Ambush!" William roared and hauled his horse sideways as the first shot cracked past his ear. What followed was fast and ugly. Bill Hutchins took a ball through the shoulder and went down. Tom's horse screamed and threw him. Dell. God bless the mean-mouthed boy, put his animal straight at the nearest willow and fired his pistol into it point blank, and a Calloway man tumbled out clutching his arm, and it was that half-second of chaos that let them break back down the road the way they'd come, dragging Bill leaving the satchel, the decoy satchel, stuffed with old feed receipts and blank paper trampled in the mud of the ford. They didn't make Helena. They weren't meant to. But they lived, all of them, even Bill, and they made it back to the ranch bloodied and beaten. And Calloway's men let them go, because Calloway's men had what they'd come for. They had the satchel. And that night, 5 miles west, Horace Calloway sat in his fine study and opened William Carter's leather satchel by lamplight, and found inside it nothing but old receipts and a ream of blank foolscap, and understood, with the first true fear he'd felt in 30 years, that he'd been fooled. The papers were somewhere else. The papers were on their way to Helena by another road, and Horace Calloway had spent every man he had guarding the wrong one. "The cook," he said into the empty study. "The goddamned cook." And Horace Calloway, who had never once in his life truly looked at a woman like Margaret Ellis, was forced at last to see her and to send every rider he had left racing south into the dark to hunt her down before she reached the territorial courthouse. Margaret was 2 days on the road, and she felt them coming on the second night. She'd made good time, better than she'd hoped. The long way round through the South Hills, camping cold without a fire, eating jerky and cold biscuit, and never once letting the flour sack out of her sight, even to sleep. And she'd near let herself believe she'd make it clean until the second dusk, when she topped a rise and looked back the way she'd come and saw far off against the failing light dust. Riders. Many of them. Coming hard. They knew. Somehow they knew, and they were coming, and she was still a full day out from Helena on a tired mule, and there was no earthly way she could outrun mounted men on that animal. Margaret Ellis sat on her mule in the gathering dark and felt despair reach up for her, and for one moment she near gave into it, because she was one tired woman alone in strange country, with the whole force of a powerful man bearing down on her. And what was a cook? What was a big gal off a wagon against all that? And then she got angry. Not scared. Angry. Angry the way she'd never let herself be in 32 years of being laughed at and turned away and looked at not seen. Angry for the men who'd near burned Bill alive, angry for the barn and the horses, angry for William standing bloodied in his own yard because a rich man wanted his water. And that anger did what fear never could. It made her think. She couldn't outrun them. So she wouldn't run. She'd hide the proof, and she'd let them catch her, and she'd give them nothing. Margaret rode hard for the last hour of light and found what she was looking for: a homestead, a poor dirt farmer's place, a woman hanging wash in the yard with 3 children at her skirts. And Margaret rode in, and she got down off her mule, and she looked that dirt poor woman in the eye, one hard-used woman to another, and she took a chance that would either save everything or lose it. "My name's Margaret Ellis," she said. "I've got proof in this sack that'll bring down Horace Calloway, and there's men coming to kill me for it. I'm asking you to take it. Hide it. And if I don't come back in 3 days, you get it to the marshal in Helena yourself." She held out the flour sack. "I got no right to ask it, but I'm asking, woman to woman. Will you help me?" The dirt farmer's wife looked at the sack. She looked at the dust rising on the horizon. And she looked at Margaret Ellis, and something passed between them, some understanding that runs between women the world has decided don't matter. "Calloway," the woman said, and she spat in the dirt. "That man drove my brother off his land 2 years back. Drove him to drink, and then to his grave." She took the sack. "You get inside. There's a root cellar. And when they come, you let me do the talking on account of they'll believe a poor farm wife before they'll believe a stranger same as they always do." Calloway's men came at full dark. 6 of them hard men and their leader hammered on the farmhouse door and demanded the woman off the mule. The big woman, the cook. And where was she? And the dirt farmer's wife stood in her own doorway with a baby on her hip and lied to their faces as easy as breathing. Said a big woman on a mule had come through hours back, watered her animal, and rode on north toward the Miller Road in a powerful hurry. Said she'd not stopped but a minute. Said if they rode hard, they might still catch her on the North Fork. And Calloway's men, who looked at a poor farm wife and saw nothing worth doubting, believed her same as they'd believed. There was no danger from a cook. Same as men like them always believed the people they'd decided didn't matter. They wheeled their horses and rode hard for the North Fork, away from Helena, away from Margaret. Ellis crouched silent in a root cellar with her hand over her own mouth. They rode the wrong way all night. And in the morning, Margaret Ellis climbed out of the root cellar into the gray light, and the dirt farmer's wife pressed the flour sack back into her hands and gave her a fresh mule. Besides her own mule, the family's only good animal, and would hear no argument about it. "You bring that man down," the woman said. "You bring Horace Calloway down for my brother and for every soul he's ground under. And you tell him a farm wife nobody ever looked twice at is the one that got you through." She gripped Margaret's arm. "We ain't nothing to men like that. That's how we beat 'em. They never see us coming." Margaret Ellis rode into Helena that afternoon on a borrowed mule, dirty and exhausted and alive, and she walked into the territorial courthouse with a flour sack under her arm, and she laid the ledger and the water right and Bill Hutchins's sworn confession on the desk of a startled territorial judge, and she said in a voice that did not shake at all, "My name is Margaret Ellis. I've come to report a theft, a fraud, and an attempt at murder by Mr. Horace Calloway, and I've got the proof of every bit of it right here." Back at the ranch, William Carter did not know if she was alive or dead. 3 days he'd waited. 3 days since the ambush at the ford. 3 days of Bill Hutchins fevered with his shoulder wound of Dell, and Tom keeping armed watch on the gates of William, standing at the edge of the yard. Every hour, God sent looking south down the road Margaret had ridden and seeing nothing. By the 3rd night he'd near lost his mind with it. Because he'd sent her. He'd let her go alone into Calloway's country, a woman he had things to say, to things he'd told her, he'd say to her face, and if she never came back, he'd have to carry those unsaid words the rest of his life, on top of everything else Calloway had taken from him. "I should have gone," he said to Pete in the dark. "I should never have let her go alone. What kind of a man sends a woman to do—" "The kind of woman," Pete said in his rusty voice, "who'd have gone whether you let her or not. You know that, boss. That woman weren't never yours to let or not let. She does what she reckons is right. Always has the whole time she's been here." The old man was quiet a moment. "You want my opinion, she's more likely to be alive than you or me. Calloway's men are looking for somebody worth looking for. They'll ride right past her every time." He almost smiled. Same as we all near did that first night. And it was the very next morning at first light that Tom's shout rang across the yard. "Rider, rider on the south road." William was running before he'd thought to move. It wasn't a rider. It was a whole column of them, and at the head, on a good horse, wearing a coat that was not her own, filthy and hollow-eyed and swaying in the saddle with exhaustion, was Margaret Ellis. And behind her rode the territorial marshal of Montana and 6 deputies and a man in a black coat who was the territorial prosecutor, all of them summoned by a judge who had read a ledger and a water right, and a sworn confession, and understood exactly what he was looking at. Margaret got down off her horse, near fell off it, and William caught her, both arms, held her up, held her against him in the middle of the yard, in front of every man on the ranch and every lawman in the column, and he did not care who saw. "You came back," he said into her hair. His voice was breaking. "You came back. I told you I would." She was crying now, and laughing both at once, clinging to him with the last of her strength. "I told you. Now you'd best say those things you promised William Carter, because I rode 50 miles and hid in a root cellar, and lied to 6 armed men, and I did not do all that to come home and have you lose your nerve." But William didn't get to say them. Not yet. Because the marshal had dismounted and cleared his throat, and there was business. First, terrible official business, the kind that ends a thing forever. "Mr. Carter," the marshal said, "Miss Ellis here has laid a case in front of Judge Thornton that I've never in 20 years seen the like of. Fraud, cattle theft, arson, attempted murder twice over." He settled his hat. "We're riding on to the Calloway spread within the hour to arrest Horace Calloway on all counts. And on account of the man's shown himself willing to burn folks alive to protect himself, I'd take it as a kindness if every armed man you've got would ride along. Because a man like Calloway don't go quiet." He looked at William. "You've got more cause than most to be there when we take him. You want to come see the end of it." And William Carter looked down at Margaret Ellis, swaying on her feet, 3 days without sleep, the woman who'd carried his whole life to Helena in a flour sack and brought back the law itself behind her. And he understood that the thing was not over yet. There was still Horace Calloway 5 miles west in his fine house, who did not yet know that the cook he'd never bothered to see had already beaten him, and who had one more card left to play, the most dangerous card of all. Because a cornered man with everything to lose is the deadliest thing on God's earth. Margaret would not stay behind. The marshal wanted her to. William wanted her to. She'd ridden 50 miles and lied to armed men and not slept in 3 days, and every man in that yard could see she was near the end of her strength. But when the marshal said she ought to rest, that they'd handle Calloway, that a woman had no place riding into an armed arrest. Margaret Ellis straightened up off William's arm and looked the marshal in the eye. "With respect, Marshal, I've been the one thing standing between that man and everything he wanted for near a month now, and I aim to see it finished." Her voice was hoarse, but it didn't waver. "I didn't ride 50 miles to sit in a kitchen while other folks decide how my story ends. I'm coming." And there was something in the way she said it, something in the set of that broad, tired body, the lift of that plain, determined face that stopped the marshal cold. He'd been about to argue. Instead, he looked at her a long moment, and then he touched his hat brim. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon you've earned that." They rode for the Calloway spread within the hour, near 20 of them, William and Margaret, and the marshal and his deputies, and the prosecutor in his black coat, and Dell and Tom and every armed hand off the Carter ranch. Bill Hutchins couldn't ride fevered as he was from his shoulder, but he'd done his part. His confession, sworn and sealed in a Helena courthouse, and that was worth more than his gun arm now. They came up on the Calloway house near noon, and Margaret felt the wrongness of it before anyone said a word. "It's too quiet," she said. The marshal reined up. "How's that? A spread this size this hour of day, you ought to see men. Hands riders somebody." She scanned the buildings, the corrals, the long, low bunkhouse. "There's nobody. Not a soul working. Not a horse in the near corral." Her voice dropped. "He knows we're coming. He's cleared his men out." "Cleared 'em out or set 'em waiting," the marshal said grimly, and he was right because that was the moment the first shot came. It came from the hayloft of the big barn, and it took the deputy riding nearest the prosecutor clean out of his saddle, and then the whole yard erupted. Calloway hadn't run. Calloway had done what a cornered rich man does. He'd paid his hardest men to stay and fight, promised them more money than they'd see in 10 honest years, and forted up in his own buildings to make his stand. What followed was a battle, and it was ugly, and it was nothing like the clean showdowns the dime novels sold. Men shooting from cover horses, screaming, the marshal roaring for his deputies to spread out and take the outbuildings one at a time. William dragged Margaret down behind a stone watering trough and put his own body between her and the guns, and Margaret let him because she was no fool, and a woman with no gun was no use standing up in a crossfire. "How many?" William shouted over the noise. 6, maybe 8, Margaret shouted back, because even here, even flat behind a trough with lead singing overhead, her mind was working counting muzzle flashes. "Barnloft, the bunkhouse that shed by the corral. But William—" She grabbed his arm. "The house. Watch the house. Calloway's not a man who fights his own battles. He's paid these men to die for him while he does the thing that matters." "What thing?" "The water right." Her eyes went wide with sudden understanding. The registered copy's in Helena, but the original William's daddy, filed the family copy, the one I found in the trunk. I left it with the judge, but Calloway don't know that. Calloway thinks the proof's still in play, and a man like that cornered with the law at his door." She turned to William. "He's not going to make a stand. He's going to burn everything that could hang him and run. He's in that house right now, burning his own records, every ledger, every payment, every scrap that ties him to Bill and the fires and all of it. And when he's done, he'll ride out the back on his best horse and be across the Canadian line in 3 days with his money, and there'll be nothing left to try him with but Bill's word against a rich man's." William looked at the house. Smoke was already curling from the chimney. Too much smoke, black and greasy. The smoke of papers burning, not a cook fire. "He's doing it right now," William said. "He's doing it right now." And William Carter made a decision that Margaret would remember the rest of her life. He didn't call the marshal. He didn't wait for the battle to turn. He looked at the house, and he looked at Margaret, and he said, "Stay here. Stay down. I mean it this time. Margaret, I sent you into danger once, and I aged 10 years for it. This one's mine." "William, his men are all watching the yard. The back of that house is open." He checked his pistol. "I can get to him, and if I don't stop him burning those records, then everything you rode 50 miles for, everything you near died for, it all comes to nothing because it's your word and Bill's against Horace Calloway and his lawyers, and you told me yourself how that ends." He gripped her shoulder hard. "Let me finish this. You got me this far. Let me carry the last of it." And Margaret Ellis, who had spent her whole life being the one who acted while others waited, looked at the man she loved, asking her to trust him with the ending. And she understood that this was its own kind of gift, that a woman who'd always had to save herself was being asked for once to let herself be part of something instead of the whole of it. "Go," she said. "But William Carter, you come back. You hear me? You said those words to me, the ones you never got to say. You promised them to my face. You don't get to go get yourself killed with them still owing." "I'll say them," William said. "Soon as this is done, I swear it." And he was gone low and fast, circling wide around the back of the fighting toward the rear of the burning house. Margaret crouched behind the trough and watched him go, and it was the second hardest thing she'd ever done, staying put, letting him carry it. The battle raged on around her. She saw one of the marshal's deputies take the bunkhouse, saw a Calloway gunman throw down his rifle and come out with his hands up when he understood he was fighting the law and not just a neighbor. The tide was turning. But slow, too slow. And every minute it took, more of Horace Calloway's crimes were turning to ash in that chimney. William reached the back of the house. The rear door was locked, but a house afire has weaknesses, and William put his shoulder to a window shutter already loose from the heat, and he was inside into smoke, into a study where the fire in the grate had been fed, sheaf after sheaf of paper, until it roared, and standing over it, feeding it his fine coat off and his sleeves rolled and sweat on his heavy face, was Horace Calloway. He turned when William came through the smoke, and for 1 second, the two men stared at each other across the burning room the rancher Calloway had spent a year and a fortune trying to destroy, and the powerful man who'd near done it. Then Calloway's hand went for the pistol on the desk. He was fast for a heavy man. But William was faster because William had a year of rage behind his hand and nothing left to lose, and he crossed the room and hit Calloway before the pistol cleared the wood. Hit him with everything, the strongest man in the county, driving his fist into the face of the man who'd tried to bury him. Calloway went down, and the pistol skittered away into the smoke, and William was on him. "The records," William snarled, his hands twisted in Calloway's collar. "You're burning the records." "Too late." Calloway wheezed blood on his teeth, and even now, even beaten on the floor of his own burning study, the man was smiling. "It's Ash Carter. All of it. Every dollar, every name. You've got nothing. A thief's word and a fat woman's ledger against Horace Calloway. You think a judge—" "The judge already read it," William said. Calloway went still. "She got to Helena," William said low and savage, his face inches from Calloway's. "2 days ago. Past every man you sent to stop her. She laid the whole of it in front of Judge Thornton, the ledger, my daddy's water right. Bill's sworn word, and the judge read every page and swore out warrants and sent the marshal here to take you. That marshal's in your yard right now, Calloway. The proof's already in Helena, sealed safe out of your reach. You've been burning copies of a thing that's already beaten you." William leaned closer. "You lost. You lost to a cook you never even looked at. She carried your whole empire to Helena in a flour sack, and you rode right past her the day you came to smile at my barn, and you never once saw her, because you decided she didn't matter. And that blindness, Calloway, that's the thing that's going to hang you." And Margaret, who had not been able to stay behind after all, who'd waited exactly as long as she could bear, and then come after him, low and quiet, through the same back window, heard every word of it from the study doorway. Heard William Carter tell Horace Calloway, in the middle of a burning room, with the man beaten under his hands, that a cook he never looked at had brought down his whole world. She would carry those words with her the rest of her life. The house was going up fast now. William hauled Calloway to his feet, twisted his arm up behind him, and marched him out through the smoke and the flames, out the front door, and into his own yard, into the sudden silence, because the battle was over. Calloway's paid men, seeing their employer dragged bloody from his own house by the very rancher they'd been hired to fight, and seeing the marshal's deputies with the drop on all of them had thrown down their guns. It was finished. The marshal took Horace Calloway from William's hands and put irons on him there, in the dust of his own yard, in front of his own men, in front of the whole assembled crowd, and read out the charges. Fraud, arson, cattle theft, attempted murder, and Horace Calloway, the biggest cattleman in the county. The man who'd never gone hungry, or been laughed at, or stood in a corner where it was safe, was led away to a wagon like any common criminal. But he stopped as they walked him past Margaret. He stopped, and he turned his bloodied face toward her, and he looked at her, truly. Looked at her, maybe for the first and only time, and there was something in his eyes that was almost wonder. The baffled fury of a man who'd been beaten by a thing he'd never thought to fear. "You," he said. "It was you. The whole time. You." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Me. A cook." He shook his head slow, uncomprehending. "A goddamned cook off a wagon. I had 6 men on every road. I had spies in his house. I had the bank and half the county in my pocket. And a cook nobody ever heard of took it all down." He laughed an ugly, broken sound. How does a woman like you beat a man like me?" And Margaret Ellis, standing straight in the dust with the whole crowd watching, gave him the truest answer there was. "Because you never looked at me," she said. "Not once. Not the day you rode up to smile at a burned barn, not any day. You looked at a big woman off a wagon and you decided there was nothing there worth seeing, and you turned your back same as every man like you's done to women like me my whole life long." She held his eyes and did not blink. "That was your mistake, Mr. Calloway. You can't be beaten by a thing you refuse to see coming, and you refuse to see me every single step of the way." Her voice softened, and there was no triumph in it, only a hard, sad truth. "A whole lot of folks in this world get looked past on account of how they're made. You're just the first one it ever cost anything. I hope you've got a long time in a cell to think on that." They loaded Horace Calloway into the wagon, and they drove him away to Helena to stand trial. And that was the end of him. The trial would take months, and it would be ugly, and his lawyers would fight it every inch. But the outcome was never truly in doubt, because a territorial judge had read the proof with his own eyes, before ever a warrant was sworn, and there is no lawyer alive who can argue away a ledger, a water right, and a foreman's sworn confession all at once. Horace Calloway would spend the best years of what remained of his life behind bars, and his great empire, all those failed ranches he'd bought for pennies, would be broken up and sold and scattered, and the men he'd ground under would get some of them a little of their own back. But that was all months away. That day in the dust of Calloway's yard, with the man's fine house burning behind them, and the marshal's wagon dwindling down the road, there was only the sudden strange quiet of a thing finally truly finished. And William Carter turning to find Margaret Ellis, and remembering that he'd made her a promise. He didn't say the words there. Not in front of the deputies and the prosecutor and every armed hand off both ranches. Margaret saw him open his mouth, and then saw him think better of it, because some words a man doesn't say in a crowd, and there are things owed to a moment as much as to a person. They rode home instead. The whole way back to the Carter Ranch, the two of them at the head of the tired column, they hardly spoke. But once, where the road bent along the creek, William reached across the gap between their horses and took Margaret's hand, and he held it, and neither of them said a word, and neither of them let go until the trail narrowed and forced them apart. It was near dark when they rode through the Carter gate, and the ranch that greeted them was not the dying place Margaret had walked onto a month before. Word had run ahead somehow, the way word does, and Bill Hutchins, fevered as he was, had dragged himself up to sit on the porch to see them come home. And Pete had a lamp lit in every window of the old house, and the whole place blazed with light against the dark, a home lit up and waiting. The way it must have been in William's mother's day, the way it hadn't been in years. William stopped his horse in the yard and looked at it at his father's house, lit up gold in the dark, and Margaret saw his eyes go bright. "I near lost it," he said. "All of it. And I'd have deserved to for near turning you away." He turned to her. "Get down off that horse, Margaret Ellis. I've got things to say, and I've kept you waiting to hear 'em near a week, and I'll not keep you waiting one more minute." Margaret got down. Her legs near buckled 4 days and 50 miles, and a battle all came due at once, and William caught her and steadied her and did not let go. The men had the sense to melt away. Pete herded Dell and Tom toward the bunkhouse, and even Bill Hutchins hauled himself back inside, and in a moment, William Carter and Margaret Ellis stood alone in the lamplit yard of a ranch that would not be lost after all. "I've been a proud man my whole life," William began. "Proud like my daddy, proud like his daddy. And pride's a fine thing in a man till it makes him a fool, and I was a fool, Margaret. The biggest kind. A month ago I stood at that door with a rifle in my hand, and a heart so beat down I couldn't see past my own troubles, and I near sent away the finest person ever walked onto this land, on account of nothing but how you were made." His voice thickened. "You saved my ranch. But that ain't the half of it, and we both know it ain't. You saved me. I was a dead man walking Margaret, a man just waiting for the bank to make it official, and you walked in with a wooden spoon, and you made me want to fight again. You made me want to live again. And somewhere in these weeks—" He stopped, started over. "Somewhere in these weeks, watching you work, watching you see what nobody else could see, watching you stand straight in front of Horace Calloway himself, and not give an inch somewhere in there, I fell in love with you. And I've been half out of my mind these last days, terrified I'd lose you before I ever got to say it." Margaret Ellis stood very still. "I know what I'm asking." William went on quiet now. "I know the world sees you a certain way. I know it's seen you that way your whole life, and I know it's hurt you in ways I can only guess at. But I want you to know how I see you, Margaret, so you never have to wonder." He took both her hands. "I see the smartest person I ever met. I see a woman braver than any man I ever rode with. I see the one soul in this whole hard county who looked at a dying ranch and a beaten man and saw something worth saving. That's what I see when I look at you. And I mean to look at you every day for the rest of my life if you'll have a proud old fool who near sent you away." His voice broke clean through. "Marry me, Margaret. Stay. Not as a cook, not as a hired hand, as my wife, as the woman who saved my home and my life both, and who I'd be honored past speaking to, spend the rest of my days beside." For a long moment, Margaret Ellis could not speak at all. She'd been laughed at from Ohio to Montana. She'd stood in the corners where it was safe. She'd taught herself over 32 hard years never to want the things she couldn't survive losing. And love had always been chief among them, the one thing she'd walled off so complete she'd near forgotten she'd ever wanted it. And now here stood a good man, in the lamplight of a saved ranch, holding her hands, asking her to be his wife. And every wall she'd built came down at once, and it near drowned her. "William," she managed, and the tears came now freely. "You know what I am. You know what folks'll say. A rancher and a woman like me. They'll talk, they'll laugh. There's not a soul in that town won't have something to— Let 'em talk, William said fiercely. Let 'em laugh. Every fool who laughs at you laughs at the woman who beat Horace Calloway, and they'll look like the fools they are. I've spent a month watching the whole world be wrong about you, Margaret. I'm done caring what wrong men think. He gripped her hands tighter. I'm asking what you think, nobody else, just you. Do you want this? Do you want me? Because I've laid my whole heart out in this yard, and I'd surely like to know if— Yes, Margaret said. William stopped. Yes, she said again, laughing through the tears. Yes, you proud impossible man, of course it's yes. It's been yes since, God help me, I don't even know since when. Since you told that boy to mind his mouth the first night. Since you sat down and ate my scraps and asked who made the stew, like it mattered who made it. She was crying and laughing, both holding on to him. I told myself I couldn't. I told myself a woman like me had no business wanting a thing like this. I told myself that lying awake in that little room off the kitchen night after night, telling myself not to want you. Her voice broke. And I wanted you anyway. Every fool night. I wanted this so bad I was afraid of it. And now you're standing here asking, and yes, William. Yes. 1,000 times yes. William Carter pulled her to him then, and he kissed her there in the golden lamplight of the yard in front of his father's house that would not be lost, and 32 years of being looked at and not seen fell away from Margaret Ellis all at once, because here at last was a man who saw her, all of her, everything she was, and found in her not something to laugh at, but something to love. And from the bunkhouse window where 3 men and a fevered foreman had absolutely not gone to sleep, but were shamelessly watching every bit of it, there came a sudden ragged cheer, Dell's whoop loudest of all, and Tom laughing, and even old Silent Pete's rusty voice, raised up glad, and Bill Hutchins pounding the sill with his good hand. Margaret pulled back laughing, wiping her eyes, and buried her burning face against William's chest. They're watching, she said. The whole lot of them, course they're watching, William said, grinning wider than she'd ever seen him grin, his arms tight around her. They love you. Every last one of 'em. You fed 'em when they were starving, and you gave 'em back a ranch to be proud of, and you taught that mean-mouthed Dell to be a man. He kissed the top of her head. They near lost you on that road, same as I did. You think they're going to sleep through this? They've been waiting on this longer than I have, I expect. Pete told me a week ago I was a fool if I let you get away. Pete said that Pete doesn't say 10 words a month. He said it in about 6, William agreed. But he said it, and Margaret Ellis laughed again, and let the man she was going to marry hold her in the light of the home they'd saved together, while the men who'd become her family cheered themselves hoarse from the bunkhouse window. And for the first time in her whole hard-used life, Margaret understood all the way to the bottom of her heart what it felt like to walk up to a door and have it opened wide and to hear. Instead of laughter, a whole houseful of people glad that she had come. The weeks that followed were the fullest Margaret had ever known. The payment to the bank came due, and William made it. Made it easy in the end, because the marshal's investigation had frozen every crooked account Calloway had strings on, and the honest men at the bank, shamed by what their institution had let happen under Calloway's influence, were suddenly falling over themselves to extend a struggling rancher every courtesy. William stood at the same teller's window where his ruin had been engineered, and he laid down his payment, and he walked out, still owning every acre his father had left him, the bottomland and the orchard, and the water right, and all of it. The hayfield came in that August, thick and green and heavy, exactly as Margaret had promised the first week she'd walked it with a pencil. Enough to winter every head of cattle, and a surplus besides. The orchard was picked clean that fall, every apple and pear and plum, and Margaret put up preserves enough to fill the mended spring house to the rafters, and the money from the fruit alone would have made 2 feed payments. The ranch that had been dying was not dying anymore. The ranch that had been dying was coming back to life in every direction. Margaret turned her clever eyes, and through all of it the story spread. It ran the way stories run in frontier country, from ranch to ranch and town to town, growing a little in the telling, but true enough at the heart of it. The story of the rancher who'd near lost everything, and the woman everyone had underestimated, who'd saved it. Folks who'd laughed at Margaret Ellis when she first stepped off that wagon a month before now tipped their hats to her in the street. The dirt farmer's wife who'd hidden her in the root cellar came to visit, and Margaret returned her good mule with a wagon load of preserves and a friendship that would last both their lives. Even the men who doubted her that first night in the kitchen, Bill Hutchins chief among them, healed now, and staying on because William had found it in himself to give the man a second chance. He'd sworn out his own soul to earn. Even those men would tell anyone who'd listen that Margaret Ellis was the finest thing ever to happen to the Carter Ranch, and God help the fool who said otherwise in their hearing. But there was one more thing yet to come. One more piece of the story that Margaret Ellis, for all her clear seeing, had not seen coming at all, a thing that would arrive on a spring morning with the mail in an envelope from a lawyer in Helena, and change the whole shape of her future once again, and prove past any final doubt exactly how far a person can travel when at last somebody opens the door. The letter came on a bright morning in May, and Tom brought it up from the road at a dead run, waving it over his head and hollering because the boy had learned to read Margaret's name on an envelope, and this one had it writ large in a fine lawyer's hand. Miss Margaret, there's a letter come for you all the way from Helena. Got a lawyer's seal on it and everything. Margaret was in the kitchen where she still was most mornings, though she was mistress of the ranch now, and not the cook, because she'd never in her life been able to sit idle while there was bread to be made. She wiped the flour from her hands and took the envelope from Tom, and she turned it over, and she saw the lawyer's seal, and something cold moved through her. "Calloway," she said. William had come in behind her, drawn by Tom's shouting. "It's about Calloway, the trial. William, they said the trial wouldn't be till fall. Why would a lawyer—" "Open it," William said quietly. "Guessing won't tell you." Margaret opened it. She read it standing at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window. And William watched her face, and he saw it change, saw the fear go out of it, and confusion come in, and then something he couldn't name at all, something that made her sit down hard in the kitchen chair. "Margaret." He crossed to her. "What is it? What's it say?" She couldn't answer for a moment. Her hands were shaking around the paper. "It's not from Calloway's lawyers," she said finally. "It's from a lawyer named of Ashford, in Helena. He says—" She stopped, read it again like the words might rearrange themselves into sense. "William, he says he represents the estate of a woman named of Eleanor Pruitt. Says she passed this winter. Says—" Her voice failed. "Says what?" "Says she left me money." William went still. "Left you money? A woman you never do? You know an Eleanor Pruitt?" "No, that's just it. I never heard the name in my life." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "But the lawyer says she read about the trial, about Calloway. There was pieces in the Helena papers on account of a man that rich going to jail's a story. And the pieces told about me, the cook that brought him down, the woman folks underestimated." Tears stood in her eyes. "This Eleanor Pruitt, William the lawyer, says she was a woman like me, a big woman, never married, on account of nobody'd ever have her spent her whole life being laughed at and passed over. Made her own money in dry goods, when no man would give her honest work, and died alone and rich with nobody to leave it to." Margaret's voice broke clean apart. "And she read about me in the paper, a woman like her who'd finally beat the men that always won, and she changed her will 3 weeks before she died. She left it to me, a stranger. She left me everything she had, because—" Margaret could hardly get the words out. "Because she said in the will, William, the lawyer, copied it out right here," she said. "To Margaret Ellis, who proved what women like us always knew and were never once allowed to show." The kitchen was very quiet. William Carter sat down slowly across from her, and he took the letter from her shaking hands, and he read it himself. The whole of it, the lawyer's careful words, and the copied out line from a dead woman's will. And when he was done, there were tears in his own eyes. "How much?" he asked quietly. "I can't." Margaret shook her head. "William, I can't even say it. It's more than this ranch is worth. It's more money than I ever knew a single person could have." She looked up at him dazed. "A woman I never met, who died alone, who spent her whole life being nothing to nobody in the eyes of the world, same as me. And she read one story in one newspaper about a woman like her winning just once, and it meant so much to her that she—" The tears came freely now. "She left it all to me. So it wouldn't just be her money. So it'd be a thing that said, women like us were worth something. So it'd say it out loud in dollars where the world couldn't laugh it off." William came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her in his arms, and Margaret Ellis wept against his shoulder, and she was not weeping for the money at all. She was weeping for Eleanor Pruitt. For a woman she'd never known, and now never would. For a big woman who'd made her own way in a world that laughed at her, who'd died alone with a fortune and no one to leave it to, who'd read one small story about a stranger and recognized in it her own whole life's worth of being passed over, and who had reached out from the very edge of her lonely death to say to that stranger across all the miles and all the silence, "I see you. I know what you are. I know what it cost. And it mattered. It mattered that you won. All those years," Margaret whispered into William's shoulder. "All those years she was out there, William. Some other woman like me going through the same as me laughed at the same and passed over the same, and neither of us ever knowing the other one was there, both of us thinking we were the only ones." She gripped his shirt. "How many others are there? How many women like Eleanor Pruitt out there right now thinking they're the only one? Thinking there's something wrong with them, when there was never one thing wrong with them but the cruelty of folks too small to see them." And that was the moment William would tell her later that he watched it happen, watched it come into her face like sunrise. That was the moment Margaret Ellis knew exactly what she was going to do with Eleanor Pruitt's fortune. "I know what this money's for," she said. She pulled back from William and she wiped her eyes, and there was something in her face now that he'd only seen once before, the day she'd first walked his fields with a pencil and started counting up all the good things a broken man couldn't see. "I know exactly what Eleanor Pruitt would want it for, because it's the thing she never had, William. The thing I never had till I walked onto your ranch and you opened the door instead of laughing." She took his hands. A place for women the world's decided don't matter. A place they can come and work and be seen and be worth something. A place that opens the door instead of laughing." "Margaret, I mean it. Not charity. Not a poorhouse. God knows we've both seen enough of them. I mean a working place. A real one. Women who've got no place else. Women turned away everywhere else. Women laughed off every wagon from here to the coast. They come here, and they learn, and they work, and they earn, and they find out they were never once the problem." Her voice was rising fierce and sure. "There's not a woman alive can't do something worth doing, if somebody'll just give her the chance to show it. I proved that in your kitchen with a pot of scraps. Eleanor Pruitt proved it in a dry goods store nobody thought she could run. We could give 100 women that same chance. 1,000. We've got the land. William, there's the whole South Quarter that's never been worked, and now we've got the money, and we've got the reason. God knows we've got the reason." And William Carter, looking at the woman he'd married, the woman who'd walked onto his dying ranch with nothing, and was now, not a year later, planning to remake a corner of the world with a dead stranger's fortune, threw back his head and laughed with pure joy, and caught her up out of the chair and swung her around the kitchen. "There she is," he said. "There's the woman I married. Not a day rich and already giving it all away to save folks nobody else'll save." He set her down and held her face in his hands. "Yes. God, yes. All of it, yes. The South Quarter, the money, every acre, and every dollar. Let's do it. Let's build the thing you're talking about. Let's open the door so wide the whole territory can walk through it." They built it that summer. It started small, the way the ranch itself had started coming back one thing at a time. Margaret used a portion of Eleanor Pruitt's money to raise a long, low building on the South Quarter bunkhouse and kitchen and workrooms all together. And she put out the word quiet at first, through the dirt farmer's wife, and the few women in town who'd been kind that the Carter Ranch had a place for women who'd run out of places. The first one came in June. A widow thin as a rail with 3 children and no husband and no prospects turned off her dead man's rented land by a landlord who wanted a paying tenant. She'd heard there was a big woman out at the Carter place who took in strays, and she came the way Margaret had once come off the back of a wagon with everything she owned in a sack, braced for the laughter, braced for the closing door. And Margaret Ellis met her in the yard, and Margaret did not laugh, and Margaret did not close any door. Margaret took the woman's sack from her own hands and set it inside and said, "You'll be tired from the road. Come in and eat, and we'll talk about work in the morning, and there's no hurry about any of it. You're welcome here as long as you like." And the widow, who had braced her whole self for cruelty, broke down weeping in the yard, because kindness when you're braced for cruelty near breaks a person clean in half. After the widow came others. They came all that summer, and into the fall, women turned away everywhere else. Too old, too poor, too plain, too big, too broken, too much of one thing, and not enough of another to suit a world that had never had any use for them. And every one of them Margaret met in the yard, and every one of them she fed first, and questioned later, and every one of them she set to the work that suited her because Margaret Ellis had a gift. The same gift she'd shown that first day with a pencil for looking at a person the whole world called worthless, and seeing exactly what they were worth. The thin widow turned out to have a head for figures, and within a year she kept the books for the whole enterprise better than Bill Hutchins ever had. A woman folks called Simple, who'd been laughed at her whole life for being slow of speech, turned out to have hands that could gentle any animal on the place, and the ranch's foaling and calving became hers to tend, and the losses dropped to near nothing under her patient care. A girl of 16, cast out by her own family for a shame that was never once her fault, learned to preserve and can under Margaret's teaching until she could put up a winter's food in a week, and she found in Margaret the mother her own had failed to be. One by one, woman by woman, the thing Margaret had dreamed in the kitchen came true. The south quarter that had never been worked bloomed. The women grew crops and put up preserves and tended stock, and mended and cooked and kept books, and the money they earned was their own real money. The first many of them had ever held that no man could take, and with it some of them moved on to lives of their own, and some of them stayed forever, and all of them left changed, because all of them had walked up to a door braced for laughter and heard instead welcome. And the Carter Ranch that had been 52 days from ruin the night a heavy woman walked into its kitchen with a wooden spoon became the most spoken of place in all of Montana Territory. Not for its cattle, though its cattle thrived. Not for its hayfields, though they were the envy of the county. It became spoken of for the women. For the growing legend of the ranch out west, where a big woman named Margaret Carter took in every soul the world had thrown away and made of them something the world had said they could never be. Travelers passing through told the story down the line. It reached back east to Ohio and Kansas, the very places that had once turned Margaret away. And somewhere in those places, other women like her heard it, and some of them set out west with everything they owned in a sack, following a story to a door they'd heard would open. And it always did open. Margaret saw to that till the end of her days. The years were good to them, William and Margaret both. The banknote was paid off entire within 3 years, and the deed to the Carter Ranch hung framed in the front room. Free and clear, William's father's legacy saved and passed whole into the next generation. For there was a next generation, not children of their own, for that was not given to them, but a whole ranch full of children all the same. The children of the women who came, who grew up on the Carter place, calling Margaret aunt and grandmother, and some of them, in the way of children who've found the only real home they've known, Mama. Margaret Ellis, who'd been told her whole life that no man would ever want her, and no child would ever call her mother, ended her days surrounded by more love than most any woman in the territory, and she knew it, and she was grateful for it every single morning she woke to it. Bill Hutchins stayed on and became again the friend he'd been before, and if the wrong he'd done was never quite forgotten. It was in time truly forgiven, because Margaret had taught William that a person is more than the worst thing they ever did, and Bill spent the rest of his years proving her right. Young Tom grew into a fine man, and took over more and more of the running of the cattle, and old Pete lived out his days in honor by the fire he'd always loved, talking a little more each year, until at the last he'd become near garrulous, and would tell any new arrival the whole story of the night. The stew changed everything, whether they'd asked to hear it or not. And Dell, mean-mouthed Dell, who'd laughed at Margaret that first night. Dell became to the surprise of everyone but Margaret the fiercest defender the women's place ever had, a man who'd fight anyone in any town who spoke ill of the ladies of the Carter Ranch, because Margaret had seen the frightened boy under the cruel mouth and set him a hard thing to do, and let him become a man, and Dell never forgot it, not once, not to the end of his life. Horace Calloway died in the territorial prison in his 7th year there, a broken and forgotten man. His empire long since scattered his name, a byword for the kind of greed that eats a man hollow. Few mourned him. And the water right, his whole scheme had turned on William's father's 30-year-old filing on the East Creek watered the Carter bottomland and the women's south quarter for generations. The single most valuable thing on the whole vast spread, and it had been there all along, unseen, waiting in a trunk in an attic exactly like the woman who'd found it. Margaret used to say that. Used to laugh and say the two most valuable things on the ranch, the water right and herself, had both been sitting in plain sight for years, waiting for somebody with the sense to look. She never let anyone forget the lesson of it either. Not once in all her years. She'd tell it to every new woman who came sitting them down in the kitchen, where it had all begun over a bowl of the same stew that had started everything. She'd tell them about the night she walked onto a dying ranch with nothing, and a proud beaten man almost sent her away and then looked again. And she'd tell them what the whole of her life had taught her, the truth she'd bought with 32 years of being laughed at, and 1 bright month of proving them all wrong. The world will look at you, she'd say, and it'll decide it knows what you are before you've said a word. It did it to me. It's done it to you, or you wouldn't be sitting at this table. And there's not one thing you can do to stop folks from looking wrong at you. That power ain't yours. Then she'd lean forward, and her eyes would shine, and she'd finish it the way she always finished it. But whether you believe them, that power's yours entire. And the day you stop believing what small men decided you were, the day you step out of the corner and say, "I did, sir, plain and unafraid," that's the day nobody on this earth can beat you. Because you can't be beaten by folks who refuse to see you. You can only be beaten by starting to see yourself the small way they do. And you won't. Not here, not ever again, not one woman under this roof. Margaret Carter lived to be an old woman, gray-haired and heavy still, and beloved beyond the telling of it. And William was at her side, through the whole of it, a proud man who'd learned the one lesson pride never teaches, that the strongest thing a person can do is look again at what they were sure they already understood. They were together 40 years. And when at last she passed in her own bed in the house she'd saved, with the man she loved holding one hand and the thin widow's grown daughter, her bookkeeper, her friend, the child of her heart, holding the other, the whole of Montana grieved, and women came from 3 territories to stand in the yard where she'd once been, almost turned away, and to say aloud, at last out loud, where it could be heard, what her whole life had proven. That a person's worth was never in the size or the shape or the seeming of them. That the one the world overlooks is so often the one carrying the very thing the world most needs. And that a single act of looking again, one man one time choosing to open a door instead of closing it, can save a home and a life, and in the end reach out across the years to save more souls than anyone could ever count. They buried her on the rise above the East Creek, where she could look out over the bottomland she'd brought back from the dead, and the south quarter, where 1,000 cast-off women had learned at last what they were worth. And on her stone, William had them carve no dates and no fine words, but only the 4 that had started everything. The 4 words a frightened woman had once spoken from the corner of a kitchen to a broken man holding a rifle. The 4 words that had saved them both and everything they built. It reads to this very day, "I did, sir." And every woman who walks onto that land still tired and braced for laughter with everything she owns in a sack is brought up that rise on her first day to stand before those 4 words and to hear the whole story of the big woman who spoke them, so that she will know, before she does one single thing to earn it, that she has finally, at the end of her long hard road, arrived at the one place on God's earth where the door will always open for her.